grains, there's still some people grain requirements in school meals. As hopefully you know, USDA just recently published the transitional rule for milk, whole grains, and sodium. And the transitional rule is effective for school year 2022-23 and school year 23-24. The transitional rule, when it comes to grains, is that it requires that 80% of the grains served in the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program be whole grain. Now, USDA does expect to publish proposed rule on the updated standards this fall. The state agency also is aware that there are some whole grain rich products that are difficult, if not impossible, to find this year. If you have a situation like that, please contact the state agencies. So, if at all possible, you want to make sure that you rearrange your meals if there's an item that's not available so that you meet that 80% rule. What does whole grain mean? To meet the criteria for whole grains in the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program, the food item must be whole grain rich, and it also must meet the ounce equivalent requirements for the grains component. All grain products must be either 100% whole grain, or it has to be a blend of whole grain meal or flour and enriched meal or flour. It is at least 50% whole grain. The remaining amount of grains must be enriched and meet the FDA standards of identity for enrichment. This chart is a list of commonly used whole grains that you might see on a food label. These do meet the FDA standards of identity for whole grain and are often seen as ingredients. Reconstituted whole wheat can also be a whole grain. You can request documentation from a milling company that they recombined the grain components to the natural proportions of bran, germ, and endosperm. Other whole grain products do not have the word whole in their description. Examples of this are like brown rice flour, wild rice, quinoa, buckwheat, and sorghum. Of course, we know we've got to have acceptable whole grain documentation, and that can be an ingredient declaration from the product container that shows the whole grain as the primary ingredient by weight. It could also be a food label that shows the amount of whole grain in grams for the appropriate school lunch serving size. It can be a copy of a food label where it displays one of the FDA whole grain health claims, or it can be a CN label for entree items that include whole grains. Additional documentation that can be used are things like a product formulation statement, a standardized recipe, or a USDA food fact sheet. These grains that are on this chart are not considered whole grains. Some of the grains on this list are enriched and can be used in a product or dish where the primary grain, another grain, is whole grain rich. Pot or Scotch barley and pearl or pearled barley are not whole grain unless it says whole barley or whole grain barley on the label. Stone ground, which we see stone ground grits everywhere at every restaurant these days, it must say whole in the ingredient statement. Then we have whole corn that is treated with lime or masa, often used in tortilla chips and taco shells. It must have one of the FDA whole grain health claims on the packaging. This chart is a list of non-creditable grains. These grains do not contribute toward meal pattern requirements. If purchased grain products include these ingredients, they must be present at a level of less than 2% of the product, or it must be less than a 1/4 ounce equivalent in order for the product to be creditable. This is an ingredient statement for white whole wheat breadsticks. As you can see, whole wheat flour is the first ingredient on the list. This product also contains oat fiber, which is a non-creditable grain. So in this case, you would need, you would need a product formulation statement to determine if the weight of the non-creditable grains exceed the weight of the whole grain. Now I'll recognize this. This is a product formulation statement for grains. And if you can't find it anywhere else, you can always get the manufacturer to complete the product formulation statement. And of course, this form requires the manufacturer to complete the number of grams of non-creditable grains. They also have to certify that the non-creditable grains, I am not changing this. I think I have a ghost in my slideshow. I am not changing the screen. But the form, they must certify that non-creditable grains are not above 0.24 ounce equivalents. So it's slightly less than a 1/4 ounce equivalent. And of course, in product formulation statements, you can find the product formulation statements at the link that's on the slide. The statement includes crediting standards that are based on grams of creditable grain and crediting standards based on the revised Exhibit A, which is the weights per ounce equivalent. To determine if a product is whole grain rich, it has to be at least 8 grams of whole grain for groups A through G on the grain chart on the Exhibit A. And for groups H and I, whole grains must be the primary grains, with all other grains being enriched. Another way of determining if a product is whole grain or not is if the product includes one of the FDA approved whole grain health claims on the package. The first one is diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and certain cancers. Another one is diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in saturated fat and cholesterol may help reduce the risk of heart disease. The ingredient label can also be used to determine if an item is whole grain. If the ingredient label lists a whole grain as the first ingredient, the product would be considered whole grain. So on this ingredient list, you see that whole wheat flour is the first ingredient, so the product would be considered whole grain. Some items will have the whole grain food stamp on it that is good information to suggest that the product is whole grain, but you always want to look a little bit further because some companies are putting this whole grain stamp on their packaging, and it's not whole grain. This item, for example, the first ingredient is enriched wheat flour, and so the item is not whole grain, but the whole grain stamp is there. It gets a little more complicated when you have water as the first ingredient, and water cannot be the first ingredient, but a creditable whole grain has to be the first ingredient after water. So you see on this item, the water is the first ingredient, but whole wheat flour is the next ingredient. So that does mean that it is whole grain. You can also use a recipe to determine if an item is whole grain. So you can use the weight of the grain ingredients to determine whether the weight of the whole grain is greater than or equal to the weight of the grain that is not whole grain. So this recipe, I'm sorry, y'all. This recipe for cornbread has 3 different grains in it. It's 50 servings of cornbread, and it calls for a ½ pound of whole wheat flour and 1 pound of whole grain cornmeal and 1 pound, no, excuse me, a ½ pound of whole wheat flour and 1 pound of whole grain cornmeal for a total of 1½ pounds. But it also calls for a pound of enriched bleached flour. The total pounds of the whole grains is greater than the total pounds of the non-whole grain. So this does qualify as a whole grain product. If a recipe is being used, the weight of the grain ingredients is used to determine whether the weight of the whole grain is greater than or equal to the weight of the grains that are not whole grain. So you see this recipe contains 4 ounces of whole wheat flour and 9 ounces of enriched white flour. However, it also contains 9 ounces of rolled oats, which is also a whole grain. So the combination of the whole wheat flour and the rolled oats equals 13 ounces and is greater than the 9 ounces of enriched wheat flour. So the product is considered whole grain rich. Ready to eat breakfast cereals must list a whole grain first in the ingredient list, and the cereal must be fortified. Cereals that are 100% whole grain do not need to be fortified to meet the requirements. I hope you've all been at least introduced to the whole grain resource. This is a USDA publication on whole grains. It's very, very helpful and informative. This resource will assist you in meeting the whole grain rich criteria, and you can download it from the CMP website. Also remember that only 2 ounces, 2 ounce equivalents of grain-based desserts are allowed at lunch per school week. You can serve non-creditable or extra grains as part of a reimbursable meal once the minimum requirements for grains are met. All extras still have to count towards the weekly dietary specifications. And remember that 1 ounce equivalent does not necessarily equate to 1 ounce. All breads and grains must be served in at least the minimum amount for each grade group. This is the new Exhibit A chart where it shows the ounce equivalents as opposed to the old Exhibit A that was done in serving sizes. So let's calculate using this nutrition fact label. Let's calculate how many ounce equivalents are in the pancakes. Using the Exhibit A chart, a 1 ounce equivalent of pancakes equals 34 grams. So how many ounce equivalents are in these pancakes? So if you take 97 divided by 34, it equals 2.75 ounce equivalents. This product formulation statement for ultra low bread states that a serving size is 1.96 ounces. Using Exhibit A, a 1 ounce equivalent of bread does in fact equal 28 grams or 1 ounce. So how many ounce equivalents are in 1.96 ounces? So 1.96 ounce rounded down to the nearest quarter ounce equivalent is 1.75 ounce equivalents. In this case, an ounce does actually equal an ounce. So using a product formulation statement for crediting, you can use the PFS for documenting grains in school meals, but make sure to include a copy of the label from the product as well. The product formulation statement must be on company letterhead and signed by an official company representative. There is a product formulation statement that is used when crediting based on the grams of creditable grains, and a product formulation statement that is used when crediting. It's based on the revised Exhibit A using weights per ounce equivalents. So here's a recipe for cornbread, and ounce equivalents can be determined using the weight of the grams in a recipe. So this recipe includes 2.5 pounds of total grain for 50 servings. Oops. So let's just look at the grain. There's a pound or 16 ounces of enriched flour. So then you can convert that 2 grams by multiplying the 16 ounces times 28.35. So the total gram of the grain is 453.60. Divide by the number of servings in the recipe, and the result is the number of grams per serving. And then you repeat the same calculation for the whole grain cornmeal and for the whole wheat flour. And with that, you can add up the total number of grams per serving, which is 1.41, but we have to round it down to the nearest quarter ounce equivalent. So it rounds down to 1.25 ounce equivalents. Ounce equivalents for cold cereal can be calculated by weight. So for group I, 1 ounce of cereal is equal to 1 ounce equivalent. This Honey Nut Cheerios weighs 1 ounce or 28 grams, so it is equal to 1 ounce equivalent. But cold cereal can also be calculated by volume. Using Exhibit A, under group I, 1 cup of any cereal round equals 1 ounce equivalent. So using this method, you end up with the 0.75 ounce equivalent. It doesn't matter whether you choose to calculate cold cereal by weight or by volume, and it may often yield a different ounce equivalent, and that's okay because either way is acceptable. So that's it for the presentation. Do we have any questions? We've got one here. What does it mean that if the cereal is 100% whole grain, it does not need to be fortified? Fortified is the same thing as enriched. But if a product is 100% whole grain, it does not also have to be enriched. If the product is 50% whole grain and 50% other grain, the other grain has to be enriched grain. Hope that helps. Can you go back to the slide with the slide of calculating ounce equivalents of grain? Is this the chart we were looking for? I'll go over this again. In this product, which was, I get it go backwards, the cornbread, we took the amount of enriched flour, whole grain cornmeal, and whole wheat flour. And here is what is in the recipe. We have a pound of enriched flour, a pound of whole grain cornmeal, and a half pound of whole wheat flour. And this is just saying that, of course, this is 16 ounces. I'm telling you, this thing has a mind of its own. So 16 ounces, and there's 8 ounces of whole wheat flour. And we're going to multiply that by 28.35 because that's the number of grams that are in an ounce. And so here is our total number of grams for the 50 servings. So we're then going to take it and divide it by 50 for each one of the items and come up with the number of grams of whole grain per serving. And so it's 9.07, 9.07, and 4.53 for a total of 22.67. And then we're going to divide that by 16, which equals 1.41 ounce equivalents. And then if we have to round down to the nearest quarter ounce equivalent, so that's going to round down to 1.25 ounce equivalent. And I hope that helps. Do we have any other questions? It doesn't look like we do. So, certainly you're always welcome to call if you have a question about whole grains or any other topic. We're always here to help you. Then let me just make a push for, if you haven't gotten in your online application, or you've been contacted to provide additional information, so that we can get your online application approved, please make that a priority. Well, everyone have a good day and a good rest of the week and a good weekend, and we'll see you all soon.